Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Allie Schlemus, and I'm here with Pacific Northwest Parent Education. I'm excited that we are hosting Sean McCormick today, as well as Dr. Katya Erman, who's going to be talking to us about executive function, study skills, relationships with teachers, really how to set us up for a great next semester. I know my kids are in middle school and high school here in the Seattle public school system, and I think their new semester started yesterday. So the timing is great. I personally have done coursework before and listened to Sean's work, and it was definitely a pencil to the paper, writing down a lot of notes, quick, actionable things that were easy to talk to my kids about. I know a lot of my personal friends with middle school and high schoolers registered for this event so that they could rewatch it later with their kids. So that is definitely going to be available in the next week. We'll be sending out the recording to anybody that's registered for the event. So first, I also wanted to thank all the donors that made today's event possible. Whether it was through a grant, through our trunk show, or online donations, we really appreciate it. The way that it's going to work today is in the chat. We'll be posting links and information that are referenced in the call or kind of pointing in directions. It's just going to be kind of like a bulletin board of information. But if you want to get a hold of me or the other people on the board or Sean or Dr. Erman, use the Q&A function and don't hold back. Be candid, ask the real questions, whether it's about study and executive function piece, organization, or whether it's about the mental health questions and things like that. It's all private. No one's information will be sent. So don't hesitate to ask those questions. We'll have time at the end around 12:45 to get those questions from Sean answered. And then at 1, we'll be handing off with Dr. Erman talking about the mental health questions that seem to always be bubbling up all throughout the year. So as I said, the link to the event and all the information, Sean is being really generous, sharing all his slides, lots of links to resources. That'll all be shared at the end. So I know you're going to have notes to take, but you'll be able to reference all of that later. Last thing I ask real quick, please. We are a bunch of unpaid volunteers trying to make this work, and we want our time and money to be spent as wisely as possible. So at the very end, there's a really quick survey, and if you have just a couple minutes to fill it out, we'll make sure that we're spending the time and money on the things that'll make the biggest impact for all of you. And that way you get kind of a personal request of what you want to hear about. And we'll be pulling from that name for someone to win a free pass to Sean's semester success blueprint course, which is worth $100. So don't want to miss out on that. But I know you're not here to hear from me. You're here to hear from Sean. So I am delighted to introduce Sean. He's a former public school special education teacher who's worked extensively with students and young adults with ADHD and autism. And yeah, all the content that I've ever heard from him, I'm like, this could be for an adult. This could be for any kid. He recognizes the vital role that executive function plays in a student's success. And that's why he founded Executive Function Specialists to provide coaching for students, for families. He launched the Executive Function Coaching Academy, which actually trains educators and on techniques and best practices to how to support all of these kids to enhance these skills. And I can speak from personal experience. His newsletter that's free that goes out every week has very actionable things in it. And we'll put a link in the chat to that as well. So you can get signed up and start getting those tips and reminders to work with your partner or teachers long after this call. So without further ado, I will pass things off to Sean, and I'll see the rest of you in the Q&A at the end of the call. Thanks.
Thank you, Allie, so much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it. I see we have 54 people here. So exciting to see this many people who care deeply about your student success, and you're proactive about trying to help them. And I hope that you walk away from this with actionable tips that you can implement today with your students and kids you love in your life. And then hopefully something that maybe also improves your life. Because ultimately the change starts with you as the parent or educator, not the kids. It's a shift for you. So let's jump into it. I'm going to share my slide deck, and then I've also shared with Ali a link where you can download all the handouts, the slides, all that stuff. So that'll be available at the end, and then potentially partway through in the chat. But let's get going. So you should see my slides on your screen, green, Kermit the Frog green, which says how to have the best semester yet. And the green is intentional. I'm a big fan of Kermit the Frog because I believe he has a great attitude on life. I have his book, It's Not Easy Being Green. So I hope you approach this workshop too with that attitude of open-mindedness. So here's the plan. I'm going to share with you what are EF skills, why I choose to focus on them, and how you can foster them with the students in your lives. And just to share, I anticipate that hopefully you're feeling good when you walk into this presentation. I'm going to be sharing a lot of stuff with you, and it might feel a little challenging. Like learning is work, right? If we don't have a little confusion, how can we learn? So you may feel a little dip in your mood, and then hopefully as we get near the middle and end, you start to see, okay, these are things that I can take action on. So that is how I anticipate you should feel. And I want to normalize right now that you're gonna hear some things that maybe it feels a little sad about data on students with executive function challenges. You might also feel like, hey, this is a lot of information, or how do I apply this to my situation? So I just want to validate that those are normal things to feel. We'll have time for questions. You can always reach out to ask specific questions to me if you'd like. So 250 million. What is that? 250 million. That is the number of students that were evaluated or basically were a part of this study on what has the biggest influence on student achievement. So this was a study in a book called Visible Learning by John Hattie. Drop it in the chat box. Have you heard of this book or read it before or heard it referenced? And John Hattie wanted to find out what are the things that influence student achievement. So he studied over 800 meta-analyses of student studies and found that there was these factors. Okay, chat's disabled. Got it. So there was these factors that influence student achievement. So for example, you can see here, teacher estimates of achievement. This is a teacher's ability to evaluate what steps or activities should they give to a student in order to challenge them that aren't too overwhelming but aren't too easy. Now, I'll go through more of these later, but I just want to share this with you so you have an understanding of some of the strategies that I'm going to teach you can use with your student. But this study also looked at what negatively impacts student achievement. And at the very bottom of these 256 influences were negative impactors. And the very bottom-most negative impactor on student achievement was ADHD across this entire global study of 250 million students, right? Now, some of you, maybe you have children with ADHD or you work with ADHD, this might not be so surprising, right? Like, yeah, this has really impacted my students' ability to be successful in school. But ADHD is often referred to as challenges with executive function. And executive function are things like planning, organization, self-regulation, the ability to identify a goal and work towards it. And students that don't have ADHD also struggle with these. But about 14% of children are diagnosed with ADHD. So it's a big percent. Now, there's also students with autism, right? And studies have found that students with autism, if they struggle with self-sufficiency or being able to do things independently, it actually predicts their mortality as adults. So teaching students with ADHD, autism, or any students these key skills that help them manage school and life are really essential for not only school, but also the quality of life that they live. And what do they have in common, ADHD and autism? Well, they have in common that challenges with executive functioning and self-regulation, which is an executive function skill. So whether or not your kid has ADHD, autism, or just struggles with self-regulation and managing school, this presentation is going to hopefully be valuable for you. All right, so what are executive functions? Well, executive functions are cognitive processes, which include attentional control, working memory. Some people describe that as the brain's copy and paste function. Can you hear something and then like 3 minutes later bring it up, or is it lost in your working memory? Cognitive flexibility, being able to take different ideas and respond to them. Inhibitory control, can you set aside distractions and focus on one thing at a time? So those are cognitive processes. But then there's executive function skills, and those emanate or stem from the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of the brain that is the most recent part of the human biological or physiological body to develop. It's the newest part of the human brain, and that includes things that help us with social skills, communication, language production. So really kind of like human elements. But it also includes things like planning, organization of thoughts, inhibitory control. And so the New York Times did a study on the brain development of youth. And you can see here that the top is the prefrontal cortex here, so the top part, and that when it's green and not blue, it's still developing, right? So you can actually see here in this image that it's still developing even when other parts of the brain have not fully developed. And to give you even a more zoned in look at this, so this is an image from this New York Times study, and they showed that even the 15-year-old student or child, as you can see here, let's see if I can kind of circle here, there's still a bunch of green areas, which mean less mature. So even though they have some development, a lot of that prefrontal cortex is still maturing. And that's the area of executive functioning. And that part of the brain is still developing until age 27, according to other research. Now, if you have a child with autism or ADHD, typically the brain development in that executive functioning area is 3 years or 30% behind their peers. So they might even have more challenges with those executive functioning skills. Another way of looking at this is that when our children or students are effectively using their executive functioning, that prefrontal cortex is sending thoughts and ideas to the entirety of the brain, right? So the whole brain can work together. But when executive functioning is shut down, the brain goes into the amygdala or the emotional core. It shuts down that prefrontal cortex and jumps into that fight, flight, or freeze or fawn mode. So we stop using our executive functioning, our planning, our consequence anticipation skills, and we jump into this really kind of like emotional state. Has anyone had a student or a child who's kind of, you've noticed they're more in that amygdala, kind of exploding into that emotional state rather than that more logical state at times? I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, okay. So we're going to work on how to keep students in this green zone and out of that red zone. Now, I've come up with this acronym called POSITIVE for parents, so you can remember what executive function skills are. Because people will say executive functioning, you're like, what are they talking about? So I came up with this acronym. POSITIVE stands for planning, organization, self-awareness, initiation of tasks, time management, inhibition, visualizing outcomes or using that nonverbal working memory, and evaluating priorities. There's so many definitions of executive functioning out there, but this is what I thought would be most essential for parents to understand about what the skills are that their kids should be working on to improve their executive function skills. Now, I do want to share with you that there's been a lot of research on executive functioning, and I'm so passionate about this because when I was a special education teacher in the public school system, it was rarely if talked about. However, when I got out and I started to coach students, I realized it was almost the biggest concern for a lot of parents. And Adele Diamond, a researcher, she did this study and she found that children with worse self-control at ages 3 to 11 tend to have worse health, earn less, and commit more crimes 30 years later than those with better self-control as children, controlling for IQ, gender, social class, and more. Okay? And that interventions that achieve even small improvements in self-control for individuals could shift the entire distribution of outcomes in a salutary or good direction and yield large improvements in health, wealth, and crime rates for a nation. So I share this with people to one, say executive function skills are important, but two, to show you that even small tweaks can have big peaks. If you teach your kids, hey, here's a process to self-regulate and not get flooded with emotion and swept away by the currents of how you're feeling, it could have a huge impact on your life. And so this is Adele Diamond who did that research. She wrote a paper in 2013 called Executive Functions. And in 2020, it was one of the 10 most downloaded papers from all annual reviews across all scientific disciplines. And this paper, she has been cited as the top cited paper. She's in the 0.01% of most cited papers. So it's a highly credible and regarded study on executive functioning. And I asked myself, I was like, why is this so popular around 2020? Like, why was it most downloaded then? So I started to search on Google. There's a thing called Google search trends. And I typed in ADHD executive function. And when did this start to get searched more? And I found that around 2020, ADHD and executive functioning started to shoot through the roof. And I think if you could look at this graph, it's perfectly aligned with the pandemic. When we all were sequestered in our homes and we had to take care of our kids and do school with them, everyone started to realize, like, oh, I'm struggling with organization. My kids are struggling with time management, and people started to look for solutions. And so she found in this paper that I'm sharing with you that executive functions are more important for school readiness than IQ or entry-level reading or math across multiple peer-reviewed studies, and that executive functions predict both math and reading competence throughout the school years, right? Furthermore, she found that people with better executive functions enjoy a better quality of life. And it makes me wonder, like, why aren't people talking about these things? Why is this not brought up in school? And I see in the questions the author's name. I think you're referring to John Hattie, who wrote Visible Learning. Okay, so before I jump into tips on how you can help your students, I want to share why this is so important to me. So I think I had a pretty normal childhood. But one of the things that was unique about my childhood was my parents used to say something like this: in any other family, Sean, you'd be on medication, but we love you, so we just love how unique you are. And the reason they said that was because at times I could be very impulsive. I was, school wasn't necessarily a challenge for me, but it was just, the way I interacted with teachers or things I did sometimes were very, what you'd call impulsive. And I had undiagnosed ADHD. And so as I got older, I remember my mom gave me this card one time for my birthday. I think I was in my 30s. And she gave me this card, and I opened the card and it said, there's one in every family. And I was like, what does this mean? And then I started to think about it, and I was like, oh, like, I guess I am a little different than most of my peers, or many of my peers, and in terms of kind of my enthusiasm. I can hyper focus on things that I'm really passionate about, but if I don't care about it, it's like, nails on a chalkboard, very difficult. So I had this one teacher in high school. His name was Mr. Winkler. And he loved me for who I was. I'd sleep through class sometimes because I'd be bored. Other times I'd be the most engaged student in the class. And he said, Sean, I think you're meant for something different. He said, why don't you check out this program called City Year? So instead of going to college, I went to this program called City Year. And it was a volunteer program where I spent a year working in public schools in New York City, helping kids organize themselves, learn how to do their homework, not teaching any specific content, just teaching them how to get organized. And through this project, I discovered that when I was passionate about helping students, that I could do amazing things, right? This was a mural that I led a team of volunteers through one day, where I helped them design the mural, paint it, bring volunteers in, put it up in a school. And I thought, wow, all those times that people had called me impulsive, or, I should be on medication, I actually have a real skill set, but I just need to be in the right environment and to be utilized correctly in order to express my abilities. And so that lady that was standing in front of me, and she was also in City Year, we ended up getting married. I met my wife in this program. And this is a picture of me graduating from college. I got my master's degree in special education. Because the more I dove into education, I realized, wow, the one thing I love doing is helping students get organized so they don't get distracted or overwhelmed. And so I launched into a career as a special educator, which was a great experience. This was one of my first jobs running a counseling English classroom. But I realized through this process that the thing I loved doing most was not writing IEPs or doing the paperwork, but helping kids learn how to self-organize, set goals, and reach their goals. And I noticed a trend that with all the students I worked with, there was missing assignments. They'd say things like, I forgot. They'd tell their parents, everything's fine. This would lead to things like no time for family activities, or they'd be over focused on YouTube, overwhelmed by their school emails. Has anyone had a kid in your life that struggled with any of these things? You can just give a thumbs up using that little reaction thing. If you've had some students who've struggled with these things, or maybe you felt like you're nagging, okay, I'm seeing a lot of engagement there. And so when my wife and we had our first child, I shared this picture with my friends and they said, Sean, it looks like you gave birth. Because if you look at my face, I'm like exhausted here, but my wife looks all happy and, bubbly here. But I realized that my executive function was overwhelmed in that trying to both drive 3 hours a day to go commute down to working as a special educator and then also come back home and pick up my kid and get dinner ready. It was a lot for my executive functioning as a parent. And so I started to coach kids on the side. I said, well, maybe I can create some more flexibility by helping kids on the side with my special skill set. Uh, and so as I started to do that, I would get feedback from parents like this. And I just want to point out this little thing here. It says, by helping with his executive functioning skills, our son was able to focus more on school and stay on top of his homework. Since he was more focused on school, he was able to reap the rewards of better grades. His video gaming decreased tremendously, and boom. And so I realized, like, wow, it's not that kids want to be playing video games all the time or doing YouTube. It's that they don't have the skills they need to self-manage school. And so as I did this more, I started to build a business around this desire to help kids learn how to manage school. And as my business grew, I started to focus more on writing helpful content for parents so that parents and educators so they could learn how to help their kids. And so, for example, I wrote this article on IEP goals on executive functioning, and this was a few years ago, and it has over 23,000 views a few months ago. Or last year, I was looking at some data, and over 70,000 unique visitors came to look at these articles about executive functioning. So this made me realize like this is a big issue. And even though it's not talked about in the school system, a lot of parents want to know more and I can help them. And I think there's a question on the paper. In the handout that Ali shared, if you click on the link and you open it, there should be a link to the research on executive function skills in there. If not, I'll drop it in later. But I think it is in there. It's just called Executive Functions 2 by Adele Diamond, if you want to Google it. All right. So now we're there. How can you help the students in your life foster executive function skills? So let me walk you through the process I've developed to help students. So to teach you this process, I am going to introduce you to a student named Edward. And Edward's a student who qualified for a 504 plan, but not an IEP. He would get feedback from his teachers like daydreamer, needs to put in more effort, should care more. And a private assessment that his parents had done had found, or with a neuropsych, had found inattentive ADHD. And his parents had tried tutoring, medication, therapy. Anyone tried a bunch of those things, but still you see the missing assignments, the overwhelm, and you're like, what is the solution? And he would get feedback from his teachers like this, like, needs more detail. Edward, this was due 2 weeks ago. What's going on here? So in my first meeting with Edward, I sat down with him and I said, hey, Edward, great to see you. Is there anything pressing on your mind you would like to discuss before we work on school items? And he said, well, no, but thank you for asking. And I could see his affect visibly light up. Now, the mistake a lot of parents and educators make is when a kid's struggling with assignments or overwhelmed, they jump right into trying to get tasks done without acknowledging the core emotional barrier that's in the way of the student working on school. And when you only focus on schoolwork, what happens is you create a fixed mindset. Now, because I asked Edward, hey, is there anything on your mind you'd like to share before we work on that? It opened his mind to sharing what's really in there. But Kids develop a fixed mindset when they see that adults in their lives only care about, hey, let's get to work. You're way behind. Why wouldn't you turn this in? It was in your backpack. Like, do you just not care? Your brother's at Yale. Like, what are you gonna do? Right? That develops that fixed mindset, like, oh, I'm a failure or I don't have skills. And what happens to kids when they feel that sense of like, I'm just kind of a nuisance for my parents or educators, is they start to shy away from interacting with people who really care about them. Right? And so it's your job to start to try to bring them out of their shell. And there's some research done by this guy, Dr. Stephen Krashen. He found that students have what's known as an effective filter. So it's this barrier they put up. And when that barrier is up, they can't acquire new information, right? So our job as educators and parents is to lower that barrier to create a low anxiety environment so that they can receive information, create new concepts, and learn. And Dr. Stephen Krashen also shared that there's massive evidence that self-selected reading or reading what you want to read is responsible for most of our literacy development. Now, this is so important because we wonder like, oh, if we just teach, how to decode or something, students will learn. But it's actually when we give them executive control over their education and empower them to make decisions that they feel are going to help them, that's when they really start to learn. Right? And so what I want to encourage you to do as a parent or educator is be a pain detective. Because when you can see where your child is struggling, then you can start to identify, acknowledge that pain, and help them identify solutions that they can take action on. So here's one question you can use to do that. Hey, Edward, for you to feel like this meeting was a great use of your time, what would be different at the end of this meeting? How would your life look different? Now, going back to that study I shared with you from John Hattie, the third highest impact or highest impact strategy is self-reported grading. And if you look at the definition of self-reported grading, excuse me, it's when students self-evaluate how they did and then identify next steps based on what went well, what didn't go well, when they start to be self-critical in a good way of like, what could I do different? Right? So if you start to ask students, what do they want to see different? And then you support them in taking action on those things, that's going to have a bigger impact than just telling them what to do. And that is the first key step in the process I've developed called PEMDAS. I call it the order of operations for developing executive function skills, is prioritize a secure connection with the child or student you're working with. And this will be broken down in the handout that you can check out. All right, who's still with me? I'm throwing a lot your way, but hopefully you're still in it. Give me a little thumbs up if you're in there. Okay, some hearts. Thank you. I appreciate that. We're all in it together. All right, let's keep going here. So then I said, Edward, can you show me what your current grades are? Now, a lot of people ask me, Sean, how do I take baseline data on my child's executive functioning? Should I use the brief? Should I use the whisk? Should I use something Peg Dawson? And all those things are good. I'm not saying you shouldn't use those, but sometimes the real baseline data that you need to capture is, do they actually even know how to engage in school? Do they know how to send an email to their teacher? Do they know how to check their grades? Do they know how to make a prioritized list of assignments? So that's the baseline data that I encourage people on a practical level to collect. And so as Edward pulled up his grades, he had a D in English, a D in math, C in science, D in humanity, a B in modern language. So he was struggling a bit. And then I said to Edward, what grades do you want to see on your report card at the end of this semester? This is a very important question, right? What would you like to see? Because if you tell them, I need you to get all B's or all A's, that's your vision. But what's their vision? And then most kids will usually say, I want at least all B's or something like that. And then you ask this, how would that feel to see your report card with all A's and B's? Now, the reason this question is so important is because we not only need to have a kind of logical or kind of intellectual idea of what we want, we also have to be emotionally connected with that outcome. And when we're emotionally connected and we're logically connected, that has way more impact, right? And Edward said, "Oh, I would feel incredible, right? People wouldn't be calling me lazy, right? So he would feel great from that." Then you would say, "Will you write those goals down?" right? Now, why do this? Well, there was a study done by Dr. Gail Matthews of Dominican University, and she found that just by writing goals down, a control group versus a group that didn't do this, they were 42% more likely to achieve the goal just by writing it down. So if that has any, validity to it, which I believe in my experience, just have your kid write down exactly what they want at the end of the semester and ask them how would it feel to reach that. You're already going to be way farther down the road just by doing that. So that's the second step in the PEMDAS method, establish SMART goals. The mistake a lot of people make is they just say, oh, I want to do better. I want to feel happy. Those aren't SMART goals. Those are vague ideas, but help them identify clearly like, hey, what does success look like for you? So then you could say, can you show me assignments, what assignments are missing and what will be due soon? So again, you're checking that baseline data. Does the kid even know how to check their assignments and their grades? And so Edward said to me, well, on Canvas, I have this agenda. I got to check there. And then I have to go over to Google Classroom because another teacher uses that. And then my one teacher, he only uses a website. So I got to go check his website. And I said, wow, Edward, that's a lot to track. That must feel kind of overwhelming. Does anyone have a student here who has to check multiple portals just to figure out what they're supposed to do that day? Yep, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Now, if that's frustrating for you, imagine how it feels for your student. So what I recommend doing is I said, Edward, let's make a list with each assignment and its point value. Do you want to do it on your paper planner or a Google Doc? Right? Now notice here, I didn't say, do you want to do this? And a common mistake parents and educators make is they say, do you have any homework? Do you want to get started on your project? And the kids are like, nope, I'm good. I'm going to go watch YouTube. Right? But what you need to do is ask yes or no questions for things that don't matter. Don't ever ask a yes or no to something that does matter. So here's an example of that. Like, as I shared here, do you want to do it on your paper planner or Google Doc? Right? I'm giving them choice, but it's not the question of do you want to plan this out? It's just, do you want to use paper or Google Doc? And why does this work? Well, there was a study done by Friedman and Fraser, and they found that individuals who agreed to comply with a small request were more likely to comply with a bigger request after, right? So get them to buy into something small first, and then they'll be more willing to actually work on the assignment. Now, in the handout, I've shared with you the same tracker that I share with all the students we work with at EF Specialists, and it's very simple. But the reason this works is for a few reasons. One, they put all their assignments in with the due date and the point value. But this last column here, has this been submitted to the teacher? Most kids will do their homework, they'll stuff it in their backpack, and then they'll forget to turn it in. So this is the next step. They need to think through like, not only have I done it, but has it been submitted? And as I said, small tweaks have big peaks. So just by making this small tweak, you can immediately help your kid solve a problem that's probably, just been out of mind for them. So then I said to Edward, I said, hey, you want to get credit for everything you work on, right? And he went, yeah. And I said, then let's make sure to email your teachers to confirm you can still earn credit. Now, what do kids say when you ask them to email their teachers or go talk to their teachers in their resource class or office hours? They say, "Oh, I don't want to bother my teacher. They've got so many other students. I'll just talk to them in class." Has anyone heard your kids say these types of things before when you suggest they talk to their teachers? Right. It's pretty frustrating. So I teach students a thing called the ping method. And the ping method starts for pleasant introduction. Hi, teacher. Hope you're doing well. The I stands for inform and inquire. I notice my grade in your class is currently a D. My goal is to earn a B. My plan is to complete the following assignments in this order. So then they just copy from that sheet I shared with you, the thing with the greatest point value, the second greatest point value, and the third. They just copy it over. Then they continue. Is there anything else you suggest I do to work towards my goal of earning a B in your class? So notice they're inquiring. They're not telling the teacher what they want. They're saying, I want to earn this. Help me figure out what to do. And then they negotiate. Will I be able to earn full credit if I complete these and submit them to you by choose date. So again, they're choosing the date. Now, I always tell students, whatever date you think you want to choose, put it a week later or 2 weeks later, because you probably have more negotiating power than you think. Or if you have a 504 IEP, you can probably get extended time as one of your accommodations. And then you end with gratitude. And I say, all you have to do is add this to show your teacher you appreciate them. Thank you for your guidance. Your name. Now, why does this work so well? Well, for one thing, teachers are overwhelmed. They're working really hard. And if a student emails them and says, what should I do to get my grade up? The teacher has to figure it out. This way, the student is controlling the narrative. They're managing their bosses. And students like to feel in control. So that's how you can frame this. And if they're scared to send this email, you could just say, hey, can we just write this out first? And usually when they write it out, they're like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to send that. Now, Edward said to me, man, that took a long time to write that. How am I going to do that for every class? And I said to him, well, you can actually just save that as a template on Gmail. So whatever you just wrote out, we'll just save it as a template. And then all you have to do is change the teacher's name for the next teacher. And you can add in different assignments. And included in the resources for today's presentation, I've given you access to an entire list of templates that I've used with dozens of different students. So you can just copy and paste those into Google Gmail so they can use those. So you'll have access to all that. And you can just click on, there's an instructional video for how to set it up. So it's easy. Students freaking love this. When they try this, they're like, oh my God, this is life-changing. And adults are like, oh, I'm gonna use this for my business. I'm gonna use this for work. So little small tweak that has a big peak there. Now, if you're wondering where that is in the resource handout, it's right there. How do I help my student communicate their needs? Just click on those templates and you can watch the video on how to do that. And yeah, as I shared, the research basis is right there. So you can just look up those, the research I'm talking about. And then there's also a printable of those positive skills. Okay, so notice there that instead of just telling Edward to do his homework or get to work, I taught him the missing skills. And this goes back to that teacher estimates of achievement, which has a huge impact on student success. I broke down the prerequisite skills he needed in order to be successful. Now, Edward was feeling very nervous about emailing his teacher, as many students would when they reach out to an adult. And 5 minutes later, he got an email from the teacher that said, Edward, I love to see you taking ownership of your work. Of course, you can turn in those items to get credit. And if you need any help, come to my office hours on Thursday at 3 p.m. And that is how you make everyone who needs to know about the goals aware of the goals. You enlist the teachers to help with the plan. Now, you might hear students say something like, oh my God, everything feels overwhelming. Where do I start? I have D's in all my classes. So start with this. What class has the lowest grade? And then which assignment in that class has the greatest point value? A simple way to prioritize. And then when they identify that, you could say, how long would you be willing to work on that assignment for? Notice I'm not asking, would you be willing to work on that assignment? How long? And sometimes students have said to me, I'll work on it for 2 minutes. That's fine. Progress, not perfection. Now, this is a key thing to understand as a parent or educator, is that oftentimes we label success as something binary. You're failing or you're successful. When in fact, if a student goes from not working on something at all to working on it for 2 minutes, they've made progress, right? Success is a spectrum. Now, as a parent, you can understand that conceptual change programs have a big shift on, or have a big impact on student achievement. And so when you teach your students that, right, a lot of students they're perfectionists. They're like, it has to be perfect or nothing at all. But if you teach them, hey, actually perfection is a spectrum, right? You start with nothing and then you move it to better and then excellent and then perfect, hopefully, or whatever you define as perfect. So this is a key concept to help students understand in different ways. And that is how you divide and guide them to continue working on those things that feel overwhelming. Now, you can't do everything with your students. So whether you're working on with them as a teacher or sitting with them as a parent, you're going to have to say something like, hey, okay, we've been working on this for an hour today, but now I got to go make dinner or whatever it might be. What's one thing you want to do before our next meeting tomorrow, for example, or later this week? right? Now, why one thing? Well, if you ask them to do 5 things, they'll avoid it. But if you identify the single most important thing they can do, that helps them learn to prioritize. And then you say, how can you show me you've done that thing? How can you prove it? Maybe they'll take a screenshot of what they've done or showing it as submitted. You let them decide as long as it is relevant or accurate, right? And this gets them in the process of extreme accountability, which students actually really appreciate. And then you could ask this, and this was a question one of the coaches in my team, Kenyatta, uses and came up with. She said, what support would you like from me to get that done? Right? Invite them to author the process. Now, if you do this process of plan, do something, check the quality of it, take action, and just keep repeating, they will start to develop executive function skills in this kind of safe space of school, hopefully. And you might be wondering, well, what about like things like tests? So why do students struggle with exams? Well, many of them have lack of formal instruction around how to take exams. They get generic advice, like chew the same flavor of gum that you're studying with in order to during the test, or maybe they cram. They have lack of deliberate practice, right? They focus on everything rather than the things they actually need to learn. So I've used this same process with hundreds of students to teach them how to prepare for even the most challenging exams that they had failed multiple times, like the driver's test. So you start with this. You look at a practice test or something that, where the content is on, and they take that thing, study it, and then they categorize the information into don't know, somewhat know, or know for sure. Everything on it, right? Then they take another practice test and see what their score is. So they're going to start to get some type of objective measure. If they don't have a practice test available from asking the teacher, you could use something like ChatGPT to come up with practice questions. You could create something, and then as they identify what's in the don't know or somewhat know column, they slowly move things over as you quiz them on it, right? Or maybe they cover it up and ask themselves, okay, what is the scientific formula for salt or whatever it may be, right? And now this process of self-identifying what they know and don't know is the same as self-reported grading. They're self-reflecting, right? And then you involve the teachers. So you might say something like, hi, teacher, I hope you're doing well. Thanks for sharing that I could get closer to reaching my goal by earning a better grade on the upcoming exam. Here's the actions I'm taking to prepare. They list out or they show this document that they're using. Is there anything else you recommend I do to effectively prepare for my exam? Any practice tests you can share with me to evaluate my current level of expertise? Thank you for your guidance. So you're not only working on it kind of like in your own scientific process, you're also asking for teacher input. And this kind of rounds the process out. Now, you might also be wondering, like, well, isn't there more to executive functioning than just managing homework or school? Like, I thought it was so much bigger than that. And the answer is yes. But this is Josh Waitzkin. He's one of the only, I think, American chess champions in like the history of the biggest chess competitions in the world. And he started to win as a child. And he said it's rarely a mysterious technique that drives us to the top, but rather a profound mastery of what may well be a basic skill set. And so what I want to convey to you is that if you can help your kid learn how to self-manage school, then hopefully they can master those skills and apply them to mastering responsibilities and independence at home. And then they can hopefully apply those to managing complex projects and priorities at work, which lead to transferable life skills. And then at the end of this pyramid, their self-transcendence, or instead of just focusing on their own challenges, they start to think of things that are bigger than their challenges, like focusing on a purpose or a mission that's beyond them, right? But it starts with learning how to manage our responsibilities in a safe environment like school. And if we don't teach them that, it's going to be very hard to learn how to manage work. Now, another thing you might be thinking right now is, what about the tough kids? And before I jump into this, Allie, this will probably take about 5 minutes more. I know we talked about ending around 12:45. Would it make sense for me to keep going right now with about 5 minutes more, or should we pause here and I can kind of wrap up? What would be better for the group?
I would say to continue on this. I'm seeing lots of thumbs up, and so I'm guessing there's people that are feeling the connection to this topic.
Okay.
So I would say continue. We'll get through as many questions as we can with the time we have at the end. And if we don't cover it, I can always touch base with you separately and send it out any resources in our follow-up email that might be able to touch on the question. So I say keep going.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we're getting near the end here. Thank you. So you might be wondering like, okay, well, Edward seemed like a really kind of compliant child, but what about my kid that's, doesn't want to leave their video gaming chair? And so you might have, heard this from a student that you work with or your child. Oh, I'm all done with my homework. Even when you know they're missing assignments because you can see it on the parent portal. Who's had that experience? Or maybe you ask, how are you going to raise that low grade? And the feedback you get is, that's not going to happen. The teacher doesn't like me. So what can you say to that, right? Or maybe they agree to do things when you talk with them, but then they rarely follow through. And you've tried pooling, you've tried begging. Have you tried bribing with YouTube or TV time? Who's been there? So this is where it goes from you trying to do this on your own to a bigger picture approach. And when I say family here, I'm also talking about the school team potentially. And so one of the tools that I found to be the most life-changing for students is what I call a family team meeting. And a family team meeting taps into this research-based practice, which is collective teacher efficacy, which is the second highest impact factor on this list. And collective teacher efficacy is basically a team's ability to identify a common goal for a student collectively and then work together in concert towards that goal, right? So enrolling the student, the parents, the teachers, all towards the same vision. The exact definition is a team's shared belief that through collective action, they can positively influence student outcomes, including those who are disengaged or disadvantaged. And a team meeting has a very simple agenda. What's going well, what needs to change, and who does what by when. Now, in the what's going well section, if you're facilitating, everyone should share out. This is where you want to curb any critical feedback. Hey, it might be, I'm proud you've been going to your coaching sessions, or I'm proud you took out the trash. And what needs to change, you say something like, what would you like to see different by our next family team meeting? Ask the student. If the parents are, well, I want all A's. Does that feel realistic to you? No, but I think I could get C's and B's. Okay, how do we work towards that? Your job as the one facilitating this is to document it. And in the handout, I've given you a template for documenting these types of team meetings so you can start to build a plan that you check in around. And then the last step of these meetings is who's doing what. The mistake most people make is that they're like, okay, this is all on the student. We set the goals, they figure it out. But actually, what should happen is parents, coaches, tutors, instructional assistants, everybody should play a role in being a support. And then the key thing is to schedule the next meeting, typically a month away, to check in on the plan and evaluate what went well, what didn't go well, what do we need to do next. So this is an iterative process that truly has a huge impact on student achievement. And as a former counseling-enriched classrooms teacher who was working with kids transitioning back from schools out of state and really challenging restrictive environments, I've seen this work with even the most challenging students who were skipping school, who had challenges with substance abuse. This process can be extremely transformational. So I'll give you an example. Hey, sounds like we're all on the same page. Edward's going to have his final history project turned in before our meeting next month. Mom, you said you're committed to ordering the poster board off Amazon. Does that still work for you? Yep. Dad, you said you're going to act as a body double and sit with him after dinner 1 hour each weeknight to be a support as needed. Are you still on board with that? Yep. Edward, you said you're going to put your phone on airplane mode until you have completed your homework, at which point you will text a picture of what you have completed to mom, dad, and myself each school night. What time should we expect that by? Or maybe say, what time between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. should we expect that by? Is everybody on board with this plan? Yep. And that is how you create accountability on the team. Because most parents who are really frustrated with this, and not most parents, I would say sometimes they just want someone to fix their kid. But when you start seeing that you have an essential role in this process, you can make a huge impact by engaging in a process like this. Now, the last part of this is I started to get messages like this from Edward, and he said, "Oh my God, I've never been more consistent with my assignments than this week. I'm usually doing it last minute. Having someone check in with me and tell me what, and me tell them when I'm going to finish it by has helped a lot." I said, "Keep it up." And so Edward's grades started to improve, but more importantly, his confidence returned, and he started to feel like, man, I can actually manage school. And then his dad texted me this: "Wow, he seems to have a new level of motivation." And I said, "What did you notice?" "He's staying up late, working hard. He went to the study group with his late this afternoon and dinner with his friends, ones from the group. Great things to see." And so throughout the process, I want to encourage you as a parent or educator to notice the small micro wins, because that is going to reinforce bigger wins. And you might be wondering, okay, does this stuff actually work? Like, yeah, how am I going to put this into practice? Well, yes. I've taught this to all the coaches in my business. So it's not just me being passionate about it. Other educators can do this. I've trained hundreds of educators throughout the world who are doing this process all over the world, and it works, right? So my question to you is, after watching this and getting this information, what's going to be your one thing? What are you going to take away from this that you're going to tweak in your life? So I think this has been dropped in the chat box, but you'll have it on the screen here if you're watching the recording of this. You can scan that and get all the resources, as well as there's a way to contact me. So I will now stop my share, and happy to answer any questions that may have come up. And thank you for your attention and giving me the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Sean. This is amazing information. I really appreciate also how generous you are with the resources, because it is a lot to take in, and most of us that actually want to implement it are going to want to talk with our kid about it. And so having those details is really helpful.
You're
Um,
very welcome. Yeah, and I know it's a lot. I try to lay it all out there. And then, for example, the resources should guide you through it step by step. I have a free series of articles called Best Semester Yet on my website, where you can go through it step by step and do it with your student. And then there's also the course if you want like a video, me walking you through it. So plenty of options if you want to take it slow.
Yeah,
Work
I
on
I
it.
appreciate that. I think the line that like sticks out with me is just learning to self-manage school. Because I think and where you kind of, if it's the first thing for them to learn to self-manage. And I have worked with a lot of high school guidance counselors to kind of even just determine what topics should we bring to this group of people, what kind of people should we hire. The number one thing they say for incoming eighth graders into ninth grade or seniors heading out of school is just self-advocacy, managing themselves, not having, their parents have to kind of hold their hand through it. And so I think this is a great guidance through that. I want to get to a couple questions. Um, so you did mention a little bit about the reward with the YouTube and things like that, but someone asked, is it harmful for their motivation to receive a reward for good grades? Like after they've done everything and they're working towards a reward, how do you feel about that?
I don't have a problem with rewards. I think most people, humans, are motivated by reinforcers. Would you go to work if you weren't paid?
Right.
Would you, exercise if it didn't make your body feel better, or things like that, or make you look better? So I don't find that reinforcers to be problematic. I think though they can't be the only driver. So one of the most important things you can do with your child is to identify what I call, what is their light at the end of the tunnel. So, you know, maybe getting good grades is what you think is important, but sometimes you need to dig a little bit deeper. So like, hey, do you want to graduate high school? Most kids are going to be like, yes. Why? What do you want to do after? Oh, well, I was talking to a parent yesterday, and she was like, well, my daughter really wants to do theater. She loves theater, but she hates everything else about school. And I said, oh, what does she want to do after high school? She said, she wants to go to a theater program. I said, perfect. That's your light at the end of the tunnel. She can't go to the theater program unless she graduates high school, right? She's like, yep. So I said, okay, so you have to put that as a big, like, this is the goal, get to the theater program. And then, okay, what steps do we have to take to be able to graduate so that you can go to the theater program or apply to that? So, you know, and then what I had her do was I had her identify like, okay, well, clearly she has to get her homework done and turn it in to pass these classes. And then what's the reinforcer? Right? Well, if she does her homework, she earns time with her friends. Or if she submits things, she gets her cell phone. So I don't have any problem with rewards. If money is motivating your child, great. Like use that as a motivator if that works for your family structure. Um, but I think it's more important to figure out what actually motivates them. Don't just assume it's money because it might be free time. It might be hanging out with someone or, whatever it might be. So, but I think reinforcers are an essential part of supporting people. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's helpful. The next question we had come in is, how do I help my slow processing 16-year-old with burnout? Because she doesn't have enough time to get all her homework done. So then she doesn't get enough sleep. So she feels like she needs to keep working so hard to maintain the straight A's. And it sounds like this student then is super tired because burnout, staying up late.
Yeah, that sounds really tough. I think I need to know more about the particulars of the situation, but just from hearing that, I would say, do they have an IEP or 504? Can you come up with accommodations or a plan where they have to do reduced amounts of assignments? Like maybe if they're doing a 25-page worksheet for math, maybe they do 10 problems to demonstrate mastery rather than 25. So I think you'd probably want to leverage their IEP or 504 if they have that. If you're saying they're slow processing, then it sounds like they've had an assessment that's identified a processing disorder. So then there should be accommodations in place for that. If there are not, I would probably take the next step to have them complete an assessment and request accommodations around that. Um, and then come up with an individualized learning plan with the school system so that they're not feeling burnt out. They do get enough sleep. They don't feel like things have to be perfect, and they can still demonstrate mastery without maybe doing as extensive as their neurotypical peers.
Yeah, yeah, that seems like good advice. There's a couple questions about the resources to help with executive function. Like, I'd love for my 10th grade son with ADHD to be taught some of these skills by someone he will listen to, not me, not his parents. What resources are available directly for him? So, you kind of mentioned, I promise I'm not just teeing this up for you to sell something, but you did mention, if it is maybe working with an executive function coach directly with a student that may need a little more, what are those options?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of options. So, okay, first off, your son doesn't want to, yeah, he's like, ah. So, I mean, I have a YouTube channel. It's free. So there's
Mhm.
videos on there on how to do this stuff. So that's one option. Um, there's a lot of people out there who are trying to there's like this younger guy and his name's Will something, like Will student success coach. He's like in his 20s, and if you start to like search on social media, how to manage school, you'll probably find someone that's relatable, that can teach these things. um I think also as a parent, you have to decide like what will we tolerate and what will we not. So like, okay, your kid doesn't want to do this. Okay, well, that's their choice. But like, what are you willing to tolerate? So for example, is it because they're getting bad grades? So you have to decide like, what are my boundaries, right? If my kid has a C or below, does that mean they have to sit with me or someone else who knows how to teach them this and work on it until they raise that grade out of C? So I think you have to get clear on like, what are my boundaries? Because if they have A's and B's, like, why is it a problem? Like they're managing it. Like, what is your boundary that's being trampled on that you feel needs to be addressed in order for you to feel good about your relationship? Because we can't expect perfection from our kids. Um, so I think that's probably an important next step, is for you to figure out like, why do I feel this needs to happen? And what boundary is being broken, and what are the options I'm going to give to my kid if they continue to, cross this boundary.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will send out the resources if people are looking to team up to work with a specialist for their kid. I mean, you have those resources of how to get that to them. I know personally, when I've chatted with you, sometimes the barrier is how do once you decide, okay, yeah, that could be beneficial for my kid, then it's also like, how do you get your kid on board to go? It's like sometimes when you're trying to get your kid to speak with a therapist or something, it's just the like, oh gosh, another adult trying to tell me what to do. And you helped kind of provide some guidance there with even how to have the conversation of why this is even coming up. So
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah.
and before we log off with you, Sean, I just wanted to give you 1 second to elaborate on that last slide you showed when you said, what's your one thing? So what, like, as people walk away and their homework today or things that they want to, really hyper focus on, will you kind of reiterate what you were driving in with that last slide? Because I really liked that kind
Yeah.
of action item.
Well, first off, there's an incredible book out there called The One Thing, and it's changed my life because as a person with ADHD, I always like, I do like 50 things in a day and I'm like, I haven't done enough when I'm, finishing work or something. But if you ask yourself, like, okay, I want to support my child with their EF skills. Like you just got all this information, right? But your brain will sort it for you if you calm down and you ask yourself, okay, if I only do one thing to make a
Mhm.
meaningful change in my child's life, what is it? Your brain will probably give you the answer, if you sleep on it or, so I would just encourage people to always ask yourself, like, all right, I know I want my kid to have a tutor and I want them to do this and this and this, but like, what is the one thing? And maybe it's, oh, I need to schedule a time to chat with them, take them out to coffee or whatever, get a Starbucks and ask them like, hey, I really want to support you and I'm struggling to figure out how to do it. Like, what can I do to help you manage school? Maybe that's the most important thing you do, right? So I would just encourage people to slow down and let your brain process some of this information, then ask yourself, like, if I only do one thing after this, what is it? I don't know what that is because it's your thing, in your situation.
Thank you so much, Sean. This is really helpful. I hadn't heard before the background, a little more personal story about you and, how you met your wife and that just a different path than the traditional path of everybody has to go to college right after school. And this is kind of hearing your story and then moving into all the actionables and the resources. So thank you for being here. Everybody, thank you for being on the call. Within the next week, again, we are a bunch of unpaid volunteers pulling this off. So give us a little grace, but we will have the recording, all the resources in everybody's inbox within a week. And hopefully, as Sean hops off, if you have any other questions, just pop them in the chat and we can send them his way. But hopefully, most of you are available to stick on for the next half hour. We are going to be meeting with Ryder to kind of discuss some mental health questions that people have. Don't forget to fill out the survey so that maybe you could get some personalized help from Sean through we'll pick one of the survey people that have filled it out to win Sean's Semester for Success Blueprint course, which is valued at $100. And then a week from now, I'm really excited that we have a partnership with PEPS. So some of the people in the Seattle area know this organization near and dear to their heart, worked with them in parent support groups with their newborns, but they also have parents of adolescents and teen support. And so we'll be continuing this conversation as we talk about effective communication tools. It's going to be kind of at this same time slot on Thursday at noon on Zoom, but not recorded because it's going to be pretty interactive and raw, and people can kind of talk with a specialist about to kind of continue the conversation after we've had a week to process it and look at all of Sean's resources. So I'm going to let Sean say goodbye, and then I'm going to introduce our next half hour with Ryder. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.
So for those of you that aren't familiar, Ryder is a mental health organization that provides, youth mental health services to kids, teens, and young adults. They offer treatment for anxiety, eating disorders, depression, and substance abuse. Their mission is to provide exceptional therapeutic services to young people who struggle emotionally and behaviorally so that they can find a path of healing and hope. So we're thrilled today to have Dr. Katya Erman, who's a psychologist at Ryther and has been for 10 years. She specializes in supporting parents and young children, and her expertise are on a lot of things that we all need help in are near and dear: emotion regulation, behavior challenges, trauma, anxiety, depression, neurodiversity. So I am so thankful that you're donating your time to be here with us, Dr. Erman. And I'm curious what your thoughts and reactions were to kind of the content that Sean had shared and how it kind of relates to the work you do. And then I'll dive into some questions that we had in the chat that maybe you can help us with. So
Yeah, I thought that Sean was super helpful. Very practical strategies. This is stuff that I often work with the families that I work with too. I thought it was great, and I'm happy to answer if people have questions around executive functioning. I'm happy to answer those as well.
great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, one thing that did pop into the Q&A was, what are some of the executive functioning skills that we can help students develop that will allow them to engage socially and emotionally versus just the academic pieces? So there's a high percentage of students who are dealing with anxiety or struggling to transition into this new spring semester outside of the academic piece. So
And it can get complicated doing assessments, right? What is anxiety? What is a genuine sort of executive functioning challenge, right? If you're super anxious, of course, your brain is not organizing really well, right? So is it sort of an ADHD native issue in the brain, or is the anxiety getting in the way of being able to use skills that you would have if you were calmer? That's a common issue when doing assessments, to kind of have to pick those things out. And we also know that kids with executive functioning challenges struggle with regulation, right? That emotion regulation piece is one of those factors in executive functioning. And so they often go together, and it can build on each other. If you have a kid who is struggling with organization or planning, they become very aware that they are not functioning well. That amps up the anxiety or the depression. They don't feel good about themselves, and it just becomes a big muddle of everything coming together. So, it's working with a therapist. If you think there's some mental health stuff going on, right, they can be a resource both for the practical logistical things like Sean was talking about, those strategies, but also help then with that anxiety, learning how to modulate your emotions, how to have more effective responses. And that would depend a little bit what that would look like on the age of the child, right? If they're younger, it might be playing it out, practicing, being able to identify feelings. For a teen, it might look more like learning things like DBT skills that are going to really help with that. And that leads into the interpersonal relationships, right? Kids who have unpredictable and volatile and big emotions struggle with friendships because other kids are a little unsure of them. And so it impacts that social skills piece too. So working with a therapist can help with all of that. In terms of practical strategies right now, modeling for yourself, right? Making sure that as parents that we are showing our kids how we want them to manage their big feelings by managing ours in that way. Talking about our process of how we're talking ourselves through a situation, modeling that we're going to take a break and take a couple deep breaths before we come back to a conversation, things like that. It can be in the same way that we're having that kind of supportive conversation around how can I support you with your schooling? How can I help you with your big feelings? And what can we do? Here's some strategies we can try. It can be, tell me what happened with your friend. Let's think that through. At what point could you have done something different? What if, what if you'd said something different here instead of that? How would that have changed the reaction? Those sorts of things.
yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
One person is asking, should I encourage my middle school son with ADHD to take advanced she said ADHD 2E to take advanced classes in academics. He excels in, but there's a struggle with executive function skills. So how do you help through those
I think that
questions?
comes down to motivation for your child, right? Is it important to him that he take those classes, or is it important to you? Because if it's important to him, he's going to be more motivated to learn these strategies. Can you get some extra supports in place in terms of either, as Sean was saying, an IEP or a 504, get some accommodations? Can you get in someone who can coach, or are you willing to do that coaching? Is he able to do that with you? I think especially for those kids, you know, you mentioned 2E, that's twice exceptional. So kids who are gifted, very bright, as well as having an executive functioning challenge in this case, it's extra hard because it is hard to know, do it, you know, if they get bored, guess what? They're going to be even more challenged in terms of staying motivated to practice their executive functioning skills. So maybe being in the advanced class is an advantage because they're going to be more into it. I think it's a conversation to have with the school team. If you've got a therapist involved, right? Things like that, that can help figure out what is the primary goal? Is it the challenge? Is it the learning the executive functioning skills? Is it, you know, what's their goal and how motivated are they to do that? Is this going to be one of those steps that leads to the end, the one thing at the end, right? The big goal of going to the particular college or going to whatever it is. So I think it's thinking about how lagging are those skills in executive functioning? Can they handle that higher capacity? And is the motivation there that's going to drive them to keep advancing?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That makes sense. Do you have any tips on how to find the right therapist for a teen with executive function challenges? I'm so afraid if we don't have a good fit, we won't be able to commit to going. And we've had friends that have had bad experiences with therapists.
I think every therapist knows that the first couple sessions are you guys seeing if you're a fit, right?
Mhm.
So we're going to do our intake process. We're going to get to know you. We're going to let the kiddo get to know us, the family get to know us. And sometimes we realize a couple sessions in, this is not a good fit. Sometimes we realize that, you know, hey, we worked on this one thing and we were a good fit for that. And then, you know, 6 months down the line, maybe you need a different therapist for this other piece. That's a really natural part of therapy. And it's always possible to switch. I know it's a nightmare to switch because waiting lists and trying to find someone who is a fit. I think, you know, of course, insurance and getting it covered is always an issue. So finding someone who's available at the time that you are able to get your kid there, and that matches whatever coverage you have to pay for it, right? That by itself is a hurdle. And then I think it's a lot of therapists offer like a quick discussion, you know, of getting to know each other. Depending at Ryther, we don't do that, but we do, you know, if 2 sessions in, you're realizing this is not a personality click or whatever, it's very easy to transfer you to somebody else. So it depends on the system you're getting into. Personal recommendations from people, if, you know, they've had a good experience, are always gives you a sense of what kind of work they do. Um, it's tough.
And do you recommend for those kind of initial intake calls or meetings where you're having those conversations for the first time to figure out if it's a fit, to doing those before your child, like to just do it before your child meets with them initially, or do you recommend having the child there for that initial meeting,
I think
knowing?
it depends on the kid, right?
Yeah,
If you're talking about an adolescent who's motivated to go to therapy and wants to, having them involved in that call is probably not a bad idea because they're the ones who really are going to be doing primarily the work with the provider. For a younger child, probably you'll do it as the parent.
yeah,
And if your kid isn't there, you can be a little more honest maybe about what the issues are. So that might be a consideration too. If you want to say honestly what's happening rather than having that
right.
negative conversation in front of them, that might be something to think about also.
Right. I'm just thinking for the kid that's maybe hesitant, and it's like, well, maybe I can help weed out somebody where I'm like, oh, this one isn't, like, versus having them interview 10 different people and be like, by the eighth one, it's like, oh gosh, mom, where are you dragging me again? Versus like, okay, I can
If you
already
can weed
tell.
down,
I
right,
can,
to your top two, having them look, often they have like a profile on Psychology Today or a website, right? Having them kind of check that out once you've sort of, it's that forced choice, even like Sean was talking about, right? Where you're saying, okay, which therapist of these three would you prefer to start with? Knowing
Right.
that, you might get a couple sessions in and realize that this person either is just doesn't personality click with you or is doesn't have the skill set that you need.
Totally. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, next question. Let's see. My child has asked to work with a therapist, but has a requirement of meeting in person versus Zoom, which has been hard to find. We also don't want her to miss school to go to therapy. Ideally, it would be someone meetings with someone outside of school hours. Any recommendations for finding a good match for her needs and ours? I get that.
I think that virtual therapy works really great for some kids. Kids with executive functioning deficits in particular, not so much, because it's really hard to stay focused on the screen. There is something about being in a room with somebody and meeting in person.
Mm,
So, I think that's a legitimate preference on the part of the child, right? To say, it just feels much more comfortable for me to do that. That said, right, I acknowledge there are not enough therapists seeing kids in this area, and it is really challenging to get that magical unicorn of meeting in person, being on your insurance, having after school appointments every week,
mm,
uh, and dealing with the issues that you need therapy for. I've been there as a parent and as the provider, and it's tough out there, especially for the younger kids to find somebody. There are more people who will see teens than the under 10, but yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
I wish I had advice, but I think it's just keep calling and hopefully you'll get someone who has someone just cancel or graduate and and you can squeeze in the slot.
Right. And maybe just don't even, right out the gates, can you meet in person? No, okay, move on. Because it's like if that's a deal breaker, then even if it's someone you love,
It's
it's
sometimes
difficult.
easier if you go to an agency or a large like group practice because then their intake team can kind of sort through a whole bunch of people all at once rather than individual private practices where you have to make lots of phone calls to get through there. But it's,
Yeah.
you know, and it's being willing maybe to take the during school appointments for a period of time. And then as the therapist, has people graduate, they can slot you in and get that preferential spot after school.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, and I mean, any questions that people have that aren't, executive function related, we can chat about really anything. I know one person had popped in and Sean touched on this as well, just how important sleep is, but how do you help prioritize sleep for your kids when societal pressure is to stay up late? And I hear this from my kids all the time. Nobody has a bedtime. Everyone can look at their phones till any time of night. Everybody's in after school activities until late, and then it's homework time and just decompress time. So any advice on how to help prioritize it to keep everybody.
I think, kids often say that everyone can or everyone does, and
Yeah,
nobody has rules like I have rules. And
yeah.
okay, we know that that's, 50% untrue, right? So recognizing like, okay, that's nice for them. In our family, we do this, right? And that might be limiting the number of activities. That might be taking the phone at bedtime, which is recommended. There's some really nice, if you Google sleep hygiene, that gives you some really nice advice around, how to maintain that bedtime routine in a healthy way, right? And kids hate it because it says no screens for an hour before bed and make sure the phone
Right.
is put away for the night and keep a consistent, schedule and don't sleep in too much on the weekends and all of these things. And right, I think it's aspirational to some extent, like move in steps towards getting there. And as adults, let's face it, like, right, we're on our phones until bed often too. So again, it's modeling, it's deciding which of those things is most relevant or most useful, trying things out and seeing, does this actually make a difference? And to some extent, having to kind of go against some of those cultural pressures of doing more and being really overscheduled.
Yeah, I know some things we've had to do is like we'll bring up some of these topics when we are at the pediatrician or with like a medical health professional, even like another friend that, is in the medical world, and be like, well, what do you think? And of course they're like, oh, sleep's so important, just to not hear it from an adult, or have encouraged at least my older kid to be like, hey, and we do this in other areas too. I know other people on the call do. Hey, you do your research, I'll do my research, and let's talk about it. It seems hard pressed to find that, the ages of middle school or any of these kids need only 5 or 6 hours of sleep. It seems like they'd have a hard time finding that, or anybody that maybe that they hold in a high regard, like an athlete or, performer, whoever, business person, whoever they probably prioritize their mental health and sleep as well. So kind of,
It's also recognizing, right, that different people have different needs, and especially kids with some challenges, right, are more likely to have bigger needs. And so sometimes it's accepting that if you have depression or anxiety, these things are more important for you than they might be for someone who isn't maybe yet suffering in
Mhm.
that way, and that's part of treatment.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, another question. Helping kids with executive function when you're as a parent are struggling with it big time as well.
I
Um,
see this all the time. I
will
facilitate one
insurance
of our,
cover
our
this?
parent support groups, and it's a constant theme because we know that ADHD and ASD and some of these other neurodiversities are often have a major genetic component, right? So if
Mhm.
you've got a kiddo who's got some executive functioning development, odds are good that at least one parent also does, right?
Mhm.
And what these kids need is a high level of structure that's really hard for parents with ADHD to put into place. And so I think it's just these steps, right? The reality is that if you're also challenged with executive functioning, having those routines and rituals in place is going to help you too, right? If you can bring down the anxiety about the morning routine because there's lists or schedules put up, you're trying to keep, you're keeping that schedule pretty consistent. That takes a lot of mental load off of you too, if you can get those routines in place. The hard part is getting them there. I encourage parents to use basically Sean's strategies, right? Of like rewarding yourself and you know, figuring out what's the priority, what's the most important part to start with, right? Those are all things that we can do as the adults too, to say, hey, right, this is like if mornings are chaos, it's hard to get everybody up and out the door, right? Maybe that's the part we focus on rather than some other part of the day because that's the most challenging and would make the biggest difference. Maybe it's the bedtime and making sure that everybody's getting to bed on time. And so figuring out what's the one thing that's the most important to do right now. And then once you have that put into place, which can take 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, right, to establish a new habit, then you can work on the next one big thing that comes up after you've gotten the first thing sorted out.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. That makes sense.
You have to think about it long term. And again, that's hard. Sometimes
Yeah.
with ADHD, that's not naturally how your mind works. Thinking about things like what works for you at work, right? How are those strategies able to generalize? And this is where maybe if you have an ADHD coach or a therapist, right, as well, that they can help you also set those things up.
Hmm. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I think focusing on the one thing is good, and communicating that with your kid. Like, this is hard for me too. Let's both like talk about it and just focus on this, and give ourselves some grace in the other areas too.
And it might be a baby step towards, right?
Mhm.
Maybe you're not going to go all the way towards being super organized at once. This is something, right? Like January, New Year's resolutions, right? I'm going to, eat great and I'm going to exercise 5 times a week and I'm going to do all these things. And they don't happen because it's too big of a goal, right? If we can set that, like, okay, maybe I'm not exercising at all. I'm going to exercise once a week, right? That's realistic. That's going to be doable. Then maybe I can add a second day once I've established that as a routine. Same sort of principle.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, the next question I resonate with. So this person says, when I'm trying to bring up planning a change in routine to help with homework habits or executive function habits, my kid, this kid in particular is 11, has a big emotional reaction. So, how do you respond in that moment when there's a big emotional reaction? You want them to allow them to kind of express their emotions, but sometimes those emotions kind of punt the topic, and it's like, oh, now we're just focused on that. I guess, like, even just bringing up this issue, now we're not able to continue the conversation. So, how do you kind of get them willing to connect and listen and engage so that maybe a change or one thing can even be established when the reaction's so big every time you're like, let's try something new, you know?
My guess is there's one of two things going on when there's that big emotional reaction. One is that this is a kid who has a lot of shame. And even
Mhm.
bringing it up is bringing that shame up, and that's really tough, right? And a lot of these kids who struggle at school or getting things done, right? They're very aware that they're getting a lot of negative feedback from people about not being able to do what they're supposed to do, and they really have that big pool of shame. The other is that they've learned that this is a really great strategy for deflecting and avoiding, and that anxiety is so big that they will use any strategy they can to get out of it. And so as the adults sort of recognizing that these emotions might be coming into play, right? We can kind of prep them ahead of time and say, hey, tonight after dinner, I would like to talk about what goal you would have for the rest of the year, or how you're going to manage your homework, or whatever it is, and give them some forewarning. And they might have the big fit then, but be able to calm down and be able to have that conversation later because they've had some time to think about it. Um, Sometimes it can help if you've got a kid who's okay with writing, you can like leave them a note and say, hey, what do you think? Can we talk about this at some point? And maybe they'll write back. With my own kids, we had a notebook for each one, and we would leave it on each other's bed. And that way we could kind of communicate about the hard topics that they didn't want to say to my face, but we could
Mhm.
just write back and forth a little bit. That can be a strategy. Sometimes if you're sitting in the car, like going somewhere and they don't have to look right at you, or you're doing something together, working in the yard or doing some dishes or something like that, where it takes a little bit of the emotion out of it because they don't have to sit there and concentrate so hard on you. They can be doing something with their hands or and looking somewhere else is a nice strategy for the adolescents, especially. Plus in the car, they're trapped with you.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it depends. It's knowing your kid. It's sort of, being curious to them also about like, hey, I notice that every time I bring this up, you're having a really big reaction. What is that feeling? What's going on? Um, and if you really are having that much trouble communicating that even those sorts of strategies aren't working, that might be a time where you get a therapist involved and they can facilitate that conversation with you,
Mhm.
and help manage those big emotions.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's helpful. I like the tip on writing the notes back and forth too. I mean, I've noticed that even with my older daughter who has a phone, like in high school, texting her sometimes I'll get a response and like setting it the time when we talk about it on her terms, like, and usually there it sometimes is a bribe, like, "I know you love Starbucks." I don't say that, but I'm like, "Oh, I was thinking of getting Starbucks. When would be a good time this week? And we could also chat about blah, blah, blah," you know? So there's like, "Oh, well, I do want the Starbucks, so I guess off I go with mom," but then her kind of saying the time, but I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it takes the nudge and the did you think about the time? Did you look at your calendar? I'm sure something better will come up in between, but let's still lock it in, you know?
Yeah.
And that's hard. That's hard. I really I really appreciate your insight. And I know there's other questions that we can table. And I mean, luckily, there is an opportunity for anybody that's available next week if they want to continue this conversation with PEPs at noon at the same time to keep talking about effective communication and things like that. Is there anything else that you wanted to share before
Well, it's
before
I'm thinking about a book that I recommend often to the parents I work with called Wise-Minded Parenting. It's more teen, sort of preteen, teen focused, but it talks a lot about do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And I think that's a
Mhm.
really wonderful place to start when you're thinking about how to approach your kids. And it gives a nice balance of strategies and sort of theoretically thinking about why are we doing these things as parents. And that I like that. I like their approach very much in terms of balancing, recognizing and attuning with your kid and what's going on. And here's some strategies for when you do need to set limits or have these hard conversations.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. Maybe we'll send that out in our resources as well, a link to that book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who stayed on for this whole call. I hope it was valuable. And please, again, if you're able to fill out the survey so that we have feedback and we're able to, bring the content that's most valuable to everybody here. And you can win the, the connection with Sean's Semester to Success. And we will be emailing everything out. It'll be in your inboxes this week, and we hope to see you next week at the PEPS event. I think we'll put the link to that because you want to register ahead of time, and it won't be recorded. It'll just be a call with everybody that is on the call, and very interactive. We'll all have our screens on and can kind of ask questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And hopefully we'll see you a week from today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.